Hello, friends, and welcome to The Wonder of It All, a podcast about blessings and curses of success in the arts and the ways creative people embrace it, reject it, obsess over it, ignore it, pretend to ignore it while secretly obsessing over it, and so on and so on and so on. I'm your host, Sean Nelson. My guest today is Jacob Slichter, whom I first met in 1998 when my old band, Harvey Danger, spent 3 weeks opening for the band in which he played drums, Semisonic. If you have ever left your house, you will likely remember their gigantic hit, Closing Time. If you have a discerning taste, you may also know the pleasures of the album that song was on, Feeling Strangely Fine, or its predecessor, Great Divide, which I frankly prefer and love, or maybe its successor, All About Chemistry. In 2004, Jacob literally wrote the book about the experience of being in a band with an outsized hit and everything it does to your brain, which is called So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star. He is also a professor of creative writing at Sarah Lawrence University and a most thoughtful, considerate, and interesting fellow. We had a lot to discuss, and we absolutely covered the waterfront, so I hope you enjoy it. Jacob, welcome.
Thank you.
We met 25 years ago, almost exactly, I think, when Semisonic and Harvey Danger toured together for like 3 weeks, 2 a month maybe.
Yeah.
And we had encountered each other previously once. It was a somewhat definitive like band disoriented by music industry, learns some important lesson by encountering another band. And it was at the MTV Beach House, which I believe was in Asbury, New Jersey. It was in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they did was they would have bands sort of do like the equivalent of boardwalk games, I guess. Yeah. And we were watching as you three members of Semisonic, I think it was all three of you, were sort of brought in front of a big tank of water.
That was awful, yeah.
In which young girls in bikinis had bullseyes painted on their stomachs.
Yeah.
And you guys were handed sponges.
Soaking wet sponges.
And you had to toss the sponge onto the torso of the teenage girl and try and, have the highest score or whatever.
Right.
And you don't have to be too interested in like symbolism to notice that is like, it's not only kind of a strange idea for television programming, but it's also like, it feels like the embodiment of everything that's bad in a way.
Yeah, it was awful.
But you were shepherded into that thing and you took the sponges and tossed them and went on your way to do whatever you had to do next. And I saw what they were having you do and I was like, it wasn't meant with any kind of like attitude, it was genuinely a question like, how can you guys do this? Because you all seemed thoughtful and in fact turned out to be very thoughtful guys. And Dan said something words that have really stayed with me forever, which was we don't even think about it anymore. We just say yes.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And I mean, by that time you had been through the experience of having released a major label album that was very good and didn't, like, it was the version of the experience of doing a major label record where nothing went the good way. Everything kind of didn't quite work, except for making the record itself, which was and remains a fantastic record, the Great Divide. But by this point, you were now in the midst of having a record where everything was going very well. I mean, do you remember a point where you decided not to think about things, not to say no, and just to do what was required? Or like, what is your memory of that sort of moment?
That's a good question. I think that it probably happened during our first album cycle for Great Divide. So Great Divide was a critically acclaimed commercial disaster. Mm-hmm. And I just remember going in front of radio programmers and not even getting an audience with them and realizing that it was just an uphill battle. And even by the time closing time came out, we were hearing things like Semisonic is not a reactive band. And we'd say, well, what about that show last night in Kalamazoo? Everybody loved us there. And they'd say,
Not
tertiary
reactive.
market,
Right.
They'd throw words like that, phrases like that at us. And I think for me, the pinnacle of it probably came after that episode on MTV Beach House. A few months later, we got our platinum records. And do you know in the movie Goodfellas when they shoot Joe Pesci?
Mm-hmm.
It's like in a basement.
Yeah,
like
he's about to get made.
It really felt like that.
Right.
We just had played a show. We were taken down to the basement of a club next door to the theater where we were playing. And 3 people were there. We posed for some pictures with our platinum records, and it felt like a funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the moment I kind of realized, there's really no winning this game,
right?
Is there? Or that was the moment that thought really first took hold. And then I think I kept thinking, well, maybe we'll prove that wrong. We never did.
That is a problem that vexes a lot of people who are in that position. But objectively speaking, I mean, that record was a hit. That song was certainly a huge hit. And, where you played shows, audiences were there. They packed, sold out houses. And in a way, the trappings were all everything looked right. If you turn the volume down, it's a movie about a successful band.
Yes.
I mean, it's a sort of an old showbiz story, but the things that look so glitzy and lovely from the audience have really turned out to just be like tinsel and fabric, and it's all kind of chintzy. In itself, that's a kind of an important lesson if you're going to be a lifer in showbiz. But that doesn't seem like it was that doesn't seem like it was the path that you were on as a band or that you were on as a person. Is that true? Let me start by asking you what your idea of what you wanted from music, what you dreamed of with music, or just what music was to you right before Semisonic formed.
I wanted it to be I wanted to be the person whose records changed people's lives the way Stevie Wonder records changed my life. I wanted my names on the songs. I wanted to be the author of people's feelings,
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of thoughts.
Right.
Looking back, that's really not how it goes. I'm not even talking about the mechanics of show business. I just think art doesn't work that way.
Unless you are Stevie Wonder, which...
Yeah, but I don't know if Stevie Wonder sits down and thinks, I want to be the author of people's feelings. I think Stevie Wonder's this is cool.
Right.
I'm going to do this.
Here's 1,000 amazing, perfect musical ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had very little idea about the machinery. I had very sort of idealized and in some senses still very real experiences of music as being really powerful and transforming for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to do that. I wanted to be somebody who made that for others.
Did you want that enough that you were sort of actively working towards it all the time, or was it just kind of one of many possible things that you could do?
No, I was all in. I mean, I was working terrible day jobs, file clerk kind of gigs. And then at home, I would just lock myself in my bedroom with legal pads of lyrics that had been written and scratched out a million times and my little 4-track cassette player,
Mm-hmm.
recorder. And I'd write songs. I didn't like my singing voice, but I hung in there. I was really grinding it out. And I think one of the things that changed was that Dan and John, who I knew when they were playing in a different band, and then that band was called Trip Shakespeare, that band kind of came to an end as Dan and John and I had sort of started this sort of side project.
Mm-hmm.
And in this side project, I was no longer the main songwriter, and I was definitely not the singer.
Mm-hmm.
I was the drummer and arranger, kind of person and sort of a songwriter. But that sort of allowed me to get some traction in reality, as opposed to the purely imaginary realm of writing songs in your bedroom and then just imagining what it would be like if you were famous.
Right.
Where there's no reality but in that picture. It's just an enclosed room and then your mind and the picture you have of what success will look like.
Right. One thing that does seem fairly true across the board is that bands are kind of defined by the push and pull of the people as a group,
Yes.
and then the people as individuals, and that sort of duality or whatever. It's where whatever special things arise from a band, they seem to come from that. I mean, obviously the music itself, but like the personalities that go into the music are as integral to that as the people are to the band, and so. Sort of letting yourself be, just the drummer is a funny thing to say in a trio.
No, but it's real. It's very real. I mean, I was definitely thinking that. Like it was a demotion. But in a way it was a promotion because now I was in the real world of making music. So I was actually getting onto stages in front of audiences, making music that more people were listening to. And I would actually be stopped on the street, and said, "Hey, weren't you playing the other night? That was a good show." So
Can you file this for me, please?
Yeah, it was both. Yeah, exactly. 15 copies of this. The metaphor I had at the time was a very Minnesotan. We were from Minnesota. It's a very Minnesotan metaphor, which was, well, my drumming will be the sort of the beak of the snowplow.
Yeah.
That's the thing that's going to give me an entrance into all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And actually it was a good decision. I mean, I remember thinking about it. I remember thinking like, wow, do I really want to be the guy who's not the songwriter or not the singer and just like mainly the drummer and maybe a couple of other behind the scenes kind of things?
Mm-hmm.
And I was 30 years old at the time, 31, something like that. And I thought, yeah, I think this is what I should probably do.
Yeah.
And it turned out great.
Yeah. I agree. First of all, no rock band can be great without a great drummer, really.
I agree. Yeah.
The drummer is so important, especially to the kind of music you were playing. But like Trip Shakespeare, whether or not they had their national identity ever like fully took off, in Minneapolis, surely they were a
massive,
big fucking deal, right?
Yeah, they were.
And so you're now in a band with one of the guys from two of the guys. Two of the guys, right? I'm sorry, but wasn't it Dan and his brother who sort of had that band?
Yeah. So Trip Shakespeare was a 4-piece band, and Elaine Harris was the drummer.
Mm-hmm.
Every date I ever took to see Trip Shakespeare, always walked away wanting to play the drums because she was so cool. And I was like, hey, I'm a drummer too.
You don't think I'm cool?
And then Matt, Dan's brother, Dan, and John kind of split the singing basically in thirds. I think Dan and Matt wrote almost all of the songs. But in terms of like sort of visibility, my two bandmates in Semisonic, Dan and John, were already very visible.
Sure.
So even at our very first shows, they were in small clubs, but they were sold out.
Right. I really liked Trip Shakespeare, and I was familiar with them, well before Semisonic was on the scene, but I don't think I ever saw them play live. But like, they kind of illustrate one of the archetypes of the kind of alternative rock major label moment, which was a band that has everything, seemingly, and has a regional following that's not just like their friends. They had a substantial following, and they were like really good, really versatile. And so what? It didn't work or whatever. Like in terms of the industry, it wasn't enough, or something didn't go right. So now Semisonic, first of all, I think having 3 singers often leads to conflict within the band, but also like having a main singer who is the main songwriter does sort of focus the attention, like where to look. It's clear like what the perspective of the band is and all of that. But like the promise of the band was from the outset, as you're saying, like if you played, your first shows, they would be sold out. There was anticipation. And then the first record was obviously for Dan and John, another encounter with major label.
Right.
And so having had this sort of like, well, okay, it didn't there were good times, but it didn't quite connect, whatever people say in the music business, it didn't happen. I don't get it. Then you guys make your first record, which, it's a perennial for me. I love that record. And there are a few songs in particular that I probably haven't gone more than a few months in the 20, 30 years since that I have, where I don't listen to it. I really return to it a lot. But then you're now in a position where that's sort of repeating the Trip Shakespeare phenomenon, where it's like, as you say, critically acclaimed, but not selling. And so the question of what is the point of going through the kind of rigmarole of the touring and the press or whatever if no one's properly paying attention or nobody is playing it on the radio or whatever? How did it feel to you to kind of arrive and then not fully arrive?
It was different for me than it was for Dan and John a little bit. Their expectations were a little more in order because they had been through it before. So I was really thinking, well, these are massive hit songs, you know. I still feel like our record company kind of botched the order of the singles. They chose the wrong song to be the first single. It should not have even been a single, I think.
Was that Down in Flames?
Yeah, it was a song aptly titled Down in Flames. And big radio stations had already started playing a different song, the song that I thought should have been the lead single, which is a song called FNT, which stands for Fascinating New Thing.
Right.
And when that record came to a close, when they shut down the record after, 9 months or so, I did feel really angry and scared. I remember sitting in my apartment, which was now covered with faxes and plane tickets. This is back in the 90s when everything was like that.
Wire-bound tour schedules.
My apartment was just a sea of paper, of video treatments and plane tickets. And I'd been on the road so much I hadn't really had a chance to really clean it up. And I remember hanging up the phone once when our manager was telling me, no, they shut it down, and thinking, wow, do I have to go back to making copies now? Do I have to do that? And then that was really scary. I think I quickly just decided, no, it's going to happen with the next one, which was it turned out to be true. Doesn't mean it was necessarily a very smart or wise kind of thought to have, but it was where you go. I don't think you become a musician by calculating the odds of success,
right?
Or attempting to do that. You just kind of assume it's going to happen.
That thing I was saying about, the tension between bands as individuals and bands as a unit, that really expresses itself in, I find, interesting ways where a lot of times musicians aren't great at direct conflict. It may surprise you to learn, but the power you have as a person in the band tends to reside in your capacity to withhold yourself from the group. And I've seen people do that where it's like, oh, yeah, I'm in this band, but I'm also doing this other stuff. And we can do it. It's fine. Rather than all in, let's make a record that actually succeeds in the way that this one didn't. That kind of true belief, it's difficult to come by in the face of, first of all, things not going right. But that's in a way kind of a generalization, because things, it's not like things that you didn't do. It's things that just, for some reason, the world of people who make whatever decisions have to get made, they just don't want to, or they don't choose to favor you with, advantages that a band needs to get somewhere.
There's also quite a bit of luck involved, I think. One of the most instructive stories I ever heard about show business was that Hall & Oates' big hit, She's Gone, was actually their very first single, and it bombed. And it was only after a subsequent single on another record, Sarah Smile, became a hit, that they went back to the earlier album and took She's Gone and re-released it. And then it became this monster smash. And I think that part of what, an important part of the equation is just this crazy luck. You know, I remember, so our next record had our big hit song, Closing Time, on it. As we were making the record, I was getting phone calls from all of the sort of like, you know, those guys, the music biz people,
right,
who were worried that the song was that the album was gonna be too soft, that the band was not loud enough for alternative rock radio, which is what we had heard. We were either too loud. We were too loud for AAA, the sort of softer stations, but not loud enough for alternative, the louder stations. We were sort of in between. So I had all these sort of phone calls with people who were freaking out about that. They wanted us to make our record louder, and Dan would not hear any of that. And I actually got kind of concerned at how out of touch it seemed Dan was with, you know, the priorities of the music biz. But he's like, you know, he's our leader. He's our band leader. And I was like, okay, well, whatever. Then when it came time for Closing Time to come out, Closing Time was sort of softer than a lot of things on the radio at that time. Right before Closing Time came out, Bittersweet Symphony by The Verve came out.
Right.
Brick by Ben Folds 5 came out. The alternative radio took this weird sort of, someone grabbed the steering wheel and just turned it towards softer for like, I don't know, 8 months. That's when Closing Time. Had we made it louder, as we had been instructed to do, it may not have snuck through the window the way it did.
Right.
So I do think that there's being a great band, there's record company people doing their jobs. I don't understand that part as well as I would like to. And then there's just this luck thing. And at the time when our 3 albums sort of, when we lost our record deal with MCA after our 3rd album, I was kind of bitter. But after a while, I shifted and sort of looked back at it now, and I think of it as improbable, you know, crazy improbable success.
It would be difficult to argue that Dan's songs aren't kind of, however loud you choose to make them, they are like classically crafted, you know, in many cases, like incredible songs, like for the ages in a way. Whether or not it is fashionable in 1996 or 7, it can be treated in whatever way. Like, I just felt my blood start racing when you started talking about people telling you that they don't think it's X enough or whatever, because that is so much of not just the music business, but really like all industries that sort of deal with art of any kind being brought to a marketplace, because it tends to be that those kind of comments reflect the sensibility of what has just been successful.
Yeah, I think it's also human nature. I mean, I teach writing, and one of my rules in my writing workshops is no prescription, no evaluation. But it's so hard to get people to follow those rules because everybody just wants to say, here's how you can make that better.
Right.
Here's how you should be doing what you do.
Right.
It's just really hard to resist. So I think when you add money to it, it becomes crazy hard to resist.
Yeah. Did you have anyone outside the band or near the band whose advice or consultation you took to heart, took seriously, and were right to do so? Or was it really just a chorus of voices and every once in a while you'd heed some of the advice and mostly not?
I kind of considered all of them to know more than me at the time. Because they would invoke what's happening at radio, which I wasn't listening to the radio as I should have been.
Mm-hmm.
I was still listening to Stevie Wonder and Joni Mitchell and just sort of living in my own little
70s terracotta world.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a nice world.
So the record label said, we don't hear any singles. And our manager, I mean, I had early on said, I think Closing Time is the single. And our manager had also reached that same conclusion. And so actually had our A&R person. But our A&R person didn't have the juice at the label to really change minds. This is like a common kind of problem for musicians. So when the top brass at the label said, we don't hear any singles, our manager called Dan and said, don't answer your phone for the next month.
That's good advice.
He said, they're going to try and get you to go in and record something else. And then they're going to use that as the single. And we're not going to get anything better than Closing Time. That's a great song. We should run with that.
I mean, whether or not it had become the hit that it became, you can't really know that. No one can know that. But to not identify that as an obvious single seems ludicrous to me, because it sounds like nothing if not a viable single, just the whole construction of it.
I think that one thing that happened is that in the 70s, the music, and before the music business had been run by evil geniuses. Mm-hmm. By the time we get to the 90s, it's run by sort of people with MBAs who are part of these huge media companies that own amusement parks around the world and film studios and yes, they own MCA Records, but they own a bunch of other labels too. And you are like, you're just invisible from the altitude at which these people are making their decisions.
Right. You might as well be the guy on stilts walking outside of the amusement park ride.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's just one of the vicissitudes of signing to a major label. It's not like you don't sign to a major label because you want to not encounter the real world of business and the mass culture. Your book was incredibly instructive in the sense of you took the business elements seriously and you knew, you understood them, and you obviously went to some effort to understand them. But I think a big part of what was called the alternative rock kind of moment in time was really predicated on people being like, I'm not even in the business. Why should I care about that?
I think there's a lot of reasons why people would not pay attention to those things. The reason I paid attention to it was because I was under the illusion that learning about it would help me.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But of course it didn't. It just made the experience more vividly excruciating.
It brought your anxieties into sharp relief. How you deal with the number of things you can't control, which is really all things, because you can control maybe if your drums are tuned to a large extent. You can sort of control how you play, but you can't control even how tired you are or what you eat, or there's so many things that you just sort of relinquish meaningful control of. And I think that it makes a lot of sense to sort of be like, well, wait a minute, understanding what the contracts are actually saying is that's a really sensible reaction to that.
I think it's sensible to understand it. And then I think that I took an extra step, which was to think that we were going to somehow be on the winning end of the contracts. And that was not only laughably naive, but really I think it got in the way of me understanding why certain decisions were made. Mm-hmm. I think it would have been better for me to understand that we would never recoup our recording advance. And that so stop worrying about how much fresh squeezed orange juice there is at the video shoot. That we're never going to earn that money back anyway.
Yeah,
it's not like they're going to come to our houses asking for the money, but but sparing ourselves a few luxuries wasn't going to get us to recoupment any sooner.
Yeah.
If I had it to do over again, I think I would have just focused more on drumming and writing songs. Mm-hmm. And understood that is kind of what you were saying earlier. Those are things you can control. Mm-hmm. The way you're received, the way you're handled by the record company, you have minimal to no control over. So take care of what you can take care of. I mean, that's just good life advice.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
And the serenity to know the difference or whatever.
Yeah.
Or the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a modified serenity prayer. But it also does that does lead right back to the beginning of this, which is like, we don't even think about it anymore. We just say yes, because that is also a sensible response when you are in the act of trying to make a thing that is getting bigger, and to be as big as it can be without violating whatever essential nature it has. Like I'm sure there is a way to have made a single hit be so exposed that it's ruined, that it can be like oversaturated or something, as opposed to like, you're sick of it. Probably a lot of people are sick of it, but it still wants to be heard. People are still playing it.
Right.
And that's an impossible thing to gauge, I think, when you are in the midst of it.
I think my biggest problem in all of our days when we were signed to MCA Records was I had so internalized the logic. The illogic of the music business had become my own.
Right.
So I think that all of your priorities have been hijacked.
Right.
And in a way, you're sort of possessed by the thinking of the music business at large. And you find yourself doing things like throwing sponges onto belly buttons, of high school girls floating on inner tubes in a swimming pool,
right.
And because it's just like, okay, is that what we're doing today? Okay, here we go.
Because it's about the music.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like you've signed up for this big endeavor, and part of signing up for it is to cede responsibility for almost every daily decision that lies before you. You're just saying, okay, whatever it requires, I'm just going to do that until we get to the winner's circle.
Right. Which is the Platinum Record Award ceremony in the basement. Like that's, oh no.
Yeah.
Having had a remarkably similar parallel, though, like not quite, we didn't get to a platinum record, we got to a gold record, but that's, essentially, so I had half of your experience or whatever, but like it absolutely ravaged my sense of perception of what was real and true or important or not important. And I felt sort of obsessed with a series of dilemmas that in many ways were just like hypothetical or theoretical dilemmas that didn't actually apply to me, but I felt like there were things that I needed to act as though I gave a shit about. when in fact, being in the business of promoting a record it's hard work, but what's hard about it is that it's the same thing every day.
Mm-hmm.
And you have been very eloquent about the toll it takes on your physical self. I mean, obviously, like we all know the thing about the songwriter who kind of goes crazy in the hotel room or whatever, but really it is the fatigue element of it that is every bit as influential on like the ability to say yes or no to things.
Right.
And as you get older and still want to, have some kind of meaningful relationship with music, the physical toll is even more meaningful, I would say.
Yeah.
Because you just did a tour with Semisonic for, nearly a month, roughly a month.
Yeah.
And obviously everything about the world in every way is different, culturally, socially, all this stuff than it was then. The work of doing a tour is exactly the same.
Yeah. Also, our bodies are older. I mean, we were told we were old back when we were doing it the first time.
Right.
But now, I'm 62 and I have diabetes. So I have like a lot of health stuff on my radar. And when I heard that we were maybe going to get this tour last summer, I started walking like 10 miles a day. I was like, this is going to be hard. Drumming every night like that and trying to sleep on a bus, which I never could do, is going to take a toll. So I started getting in shape almost a year out.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got off the tour, We did the tour. When we got off the tour, I slept for like 12 hours a night for like 2 weeks. And it is depleting. It's just really depleting. I don't know how Taylor Swift does it. She's out there like on her own, on stage, in front of an entire stadium. And
for like 3 or 4
for
hours.
3 or 4 hours a night. I don't know how the Taylor Swifts and Janet Jacksons and Michael Jackson back in his day. Mm-hmm. I think it partly is about a clarity of will and ambition that I don't think I have.
Right.
That Taylor Swift, for instance, does have. Mm-hmm. And people think of ambition as a bad thing. I think it's exciting. Mm-hmm. If a band takes the stage and I don't see the ambition or hear it, I'm immediately uninterested.
Right.
But I think that being clear about who you are and what it is you're there to do is part of that equation. And the more of that you have, the more efficiently you're able to sacrifice and just make it happen.
Right. I mean, I do think also, though, that the intensity of the desire of people to see it, the people who are really begging for it, has to be a factor. And that's really different from it does occur in rock bands of a certain stripe or certain like level of success or whatever. But like you write about the show at RFK Stadium in your book, I played that show too.
That's right.
We were on the second stage, but it was still the biggest thing I'd ever seen. I couldn't believe it. It was a football stadium, and it was incredible. And it was also like, what are we doing here? You know, like, why is that? Why are we even invited?
Right.
But that still, like, no matter how exhausted you might have been or how callous you might have been about what was going on or whatever, I mean, you had played Closing Time at least once a day, if not 5 times a day for the last X number of months, but playing it in front of people who are like exploding with desire for it in that moment changes it. It changes, like the audience changes the performance.
I think the audience really is the show. Mm-hmm. The proof of this for me is that soundcheck is never interesting.
Right.
Soundcheck is boring, but the band is there. The band might be playing the song nearly exactly as they're going to play it that night, but there's no crowd there.
Right.
The minute you add the crowd, that's when it becomes a show. And so really, it's the crowd that is the show. It's in the same way that I watched this show called 100-Foot Wave, in which these surfers are like taking on these insanely huge waves. Well, the band is the person on the surfboard, but the crowd is the wave.
Right.
And if you don't have that wave, it's just nothing.
Right.
And I think that the crowd actually knows that, weirdly. I think that they may not have articulated it for themselves, but they know their power, and they love having that power collectively.
I mean, it is thrilling. I've certainly had that experience just like at shows. I can think of many examples of that, just as many as I can think of having seen a band be incredible and just be personally blown away in the moment. But like the phenomenon of those radio festivals, like that one that was at RFK Stadium, that was WHF Festival, which was, I mean, certainly one of the bigger versions of it, but there were, smaller ones that were still enormous crowds, still, anywhere between whatever, 10 and 50,000 people who tend to be like committed listeners to a station. And you play for a short set, and obviously the radio song is the thing, it's the attraction. And the acting out in real life of the thing that you're getting on the radio, there was an element of that always seemed like, I mean, it's great to have had the experience of playing in stadium settings or even arena settings. That is a thing that is unavailable to almost all bands.
Right.
Very few bands get that. And even when you have it in that sort of, if you squint, you feel like you're at a stadium full of people who are there to see you. And they are kind of, but it's still like there's an element of it that is counterfeit almost, like or some, like it's not quite the thing.
There's a lot of imagination taking up the glass.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the magic thing of radio was always you didn't pick it, but it still was sent to you, and we're all having that experience. That kind of collective identity is just less available now, it seems, in the culture. And that's one of the big transformations that has occurred in a world of things that seems to have transformed. I guess you could argue it's not for the worse, but it feels like it's for the worse. It feels like estrangement is much more the order of the day than like being united in any way.
Yeah, you do gain some things. You gain the ability to listen to what you want to listen to when you want to listen to it, under the circumstances and in the setting that you want to listen to it. What you lose is that sort of buzzy feeling of connection that comes when other people are standing right next to you and maybe blocking your view and all the other inconveniences of live shows. But there's something undeniably amazing and exciting about it.
Right.
Just like going to the movies.
Yeah, very much so. It's just surrendering, being the personal sort of selector of everything that's happening. It's a certain amount of surrender is important for there to be any kind of group culture, you know, and that's, I think, harder to get people to be willing to do. I mean, 1998 was when Closing Time was a hit. It was when Flagpole said it was a hit. They were happening at the same time. I really feel like that was more or less the last moment of whatever had, like the things that changed all started changing immediately after that. And they were maybe like on the way to changing, but like, I don't know what your experience was with Napster, but it was a thing that I kept being asked about, either in interviews, or by like kids waiting in line to get into a show, and they'd be like, "I got your thing on Napster," and I know it was a very controversial thing, and some musicians towed the line of being like, "You're stealing from us," while my perspective was always like, it feels a little like being a writer and objecting to libraries. I mean, it's not actually one-to-one, but I didn't understand the sort of tech biz ramifications of it. I only understood that, like, when we put out our record initially, there were 1,200 copies with cardboard sleeves, and in the record store it cost $12. When we signed to a major label and that same record came out exactly the same with a proper like jewel box and a printed cover printed by machines, it was $18.99. And that is like, yeah, $6.99, maybe not all the money in the world, but if you were 12, 13, it's a significant difference. And then when you find out the reason for that is that, well, 4 other sub-distributors all have to take their nickel out of the thing. Like, there's no good reason for it happening. It's just how it was done. The idea of like people finding a way to steal it, make it free or whatever, it didn't, like, I couldn't be offended by it. I maybe have come to be offended by it subsequently. Or not offended, but like I get the objection to it now more than I did then. But it was like, that was a seismic disruption. Presumably your band and my band both lost some money, but like really in a much bigger way, it represented this new thing of people having this kind of self-determination and not waiting for the radio to play the song they want, or not needing to go and buy a thing. Where were you on the question of Napster and that sort of stuff?
I always thought, one of the things that people who are sort of Napster advocates would say is, well, music belongs to the people.
Right.
And my thought about that has always been, I'm down with music belonging to the people, but I want healthcare to belong to the people.
Right.
I want shelter and clothing and free college and universal basic income to belong to the people too.
Don't just be socialist about my fucking
record.
record.
Don't throw me
That's
into
fine.
the swimming pool, then continue to like go over there and do your own thing. Like, let's all jump into the pool together.
Right.
And I felt it less like I felt like Semisonic had this crazy privileged kind of experience of the music business. We were huge winners in that system.
It's sort of the last ones through the door where like Napster was incipient, but it was not regnant yet.
Yeah.
And then by the time you were making the follow-up record, maybe the hunger for ripping off the record might not have been quite as strong or something because it didn't get exposed in the same way that Feeling Strangely Fine did.
Yeah, maybe.
You said that, your own internal logic was sort of replaced or supplanted by music industry logic.
Right.
Did you then take the collapse of the music business personally? Did you feel like it was wrong? Or, I don't know, did you cheer it on?
I mean, the only way in which I took it personally was that it affected me personally. I didn't feel like I had been wronged. I feel like the music business, what happened to it was inevitable. Mm-hmm. The greed, the consolidation, it's all the same stuff that just happens everywhere else in the economy. It became more and more of a winner-take-all kind of system where a very few people got almost everything and the remaining few tidbits were spread out like the smallest helping of butter over a very big piece of toast. So
it's a huge piece of toast.
Yeah. So I think that's like, and to this day, people say, what do you think about Spotify? What do you think about all of that? And quite honestly, I think that our focus should be on things like healthcare. Like, I think the lives of almost all musicians would be immeasurably improved if we had a single-payer universal healthcare system, a universal basic income, and if we got rid of student debt, just to name three things, that would radically improve the lives of almost every musician, far beyond whatever solutions you could come up with for Spotify. I mean, I just think playing whack-a-mole with capitalism is just, you're never going to win that game.
Maybe it was this way before. I know it was a strand of the discourse, as we laughingly call it. But like, I know it was something that people talked about the business in the larger culture. Certainly when REM signed the biggest record deal of all time, it was news, and it was also something that people sort of discussed among each other in the band world. But like, only a handful of people sort of took it upon themselves to feel like they understood the business enough to really weigh in on it. Whereas now, I feel like the business of entertainment is the subject, and the work itself is sort of like, oh yeah, well, I haven't heard it, but I can tell you why this record is not going to work in the marketplace or whatever. I'm amazed at the degree to which that has happened in my lifetime. Because for a long time, it very much like in the movie world where I remember people lamenting the fact that they were reporting the top 10 box office figures in the newspaper every week. And I was like, I mean, yeah, it's sort of, sure, it's vacuous or shallow or whatever, but like, it is of interest because it's interesting to know what the most people are seeing. Like, there's just like an element of interest about it.
It's also the easiest to write about. Metrics are much more easier to write about than a guitar sound,
right,
or a chorus.
It's true, and most people who experience music have no idea what that is, like what a guitar sound is necessarily, or they could hear the difference between two things, but they don't necessarily know that they're hearing it.
I mean, I've never read a vividly accurate description of the guitars on the My Bloody Valentine record.
You don't like shimmering?
Or the sound of Stevie Wonder's electric piano.
Mm-hmm.
The particular bite that the attack of his keys produce on the sound. It's really hard to write about those kinds of things. And I think if you're a reporter on Deadline and you've got to now you're you're trying to get clicks and all of those things. And I just think the whole operation pushes us in the direction of these kinds of discussions.
I agree on a media level, but like it has filtered down to human beings.
Yes.
Not that media people aren't human beings, although it's what people talk about. I mean, or at least people as they are represented by social media.
I'll give you a good example of how I think this goes. It's in the world of drumming.
Mm-hmm.
I started a blog because I was so fed up with how people discuss drumming. They would discuss hand speed, complexity of rhythms, and metronomic steadiness, all of which are important.
They're factors.
Important things, aspects of drumming. But when I listen to Earl Young play very simple beats on those old Spinners records, there's something happening that none of those discussions get to. I wanted to start creating a language where I could at least get to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I started a blog to explore that, and then it went off into other things as well. But I mention it only because I think that even within the realm of music, it's very hard to talk about how Joni Mitchell's alternate tunings, for instance, and how they are, and how her way of hearing the guitar in her mind creates an entire emotional landscape. It's just really hard to talk about. It would take quite a bit of time to sit down and create a way for people to think about that. I think it would be really worth doing. But if you're a journalist, you don't have that luxury.
I mean, I agree. I wrote a little book about Joni Mitchell, and I had no luck trying to describe. It's hard to describe sound using terms that aren't about like the magnitude of it or whatever. But I only have what my sort of heart and mind combine to tell me about the music I'm hearing, which has always been my approach both to describing music and also to making music. I mean, technically, I am professional, semi-professional anyway.
Right.
I don't have any idea how to talk about a lot of this stuff. And I don't know that there is an accepted vocabulary for it among even like really devout people. But you talk about the effect it has on you.
Right.
And that opens up a world where people can then connect with each other via this music, which is what a collective experience of this stuff affords us.
Yes.
And that continues to be sort of elusive. It gets more and more difficult to come by, and has been to a large extent replaced by people talking about, well, Joni Mitchell's great, but she never sold any records or whatever, which is her complaint about everything, you know? Not to mention her complaint that she never sold enough records, but that you would favor Bob Dylan with this kind of genius versus super genius discourse while not acknowledging that she is every bit as important and fascinating. It's just like this colossal insult that never stops rankling her. And I agree, though no shade on Bob Dylan. But like, this is all by way of saying that nobody's having these arguments about Semisonic and Harvey Danger probably. But like when you were talking about wanting to be the author of people's feelings, that's what that is.
Yeah.
But you can't literally be the author of it. You have to make the thing that then provides or is accompanying the experiences that then lead to the feelings, and then I don't know.
What you really can do as an artist is just speak for yourself as clearly and precisely as possible. If you do it enough, you'll probably stumble onto creating a few things that other people recognize speaks for them.
Right. And it is also part of the path to even understanding what yourself is.
Yeah.
And again, the self, like, it's a common complaint that we all talk about ourselves too much or advertise ourselves too much. And I'm really sympathetic to it, even as one who talks about himself incessantly. But like, the self is a fascinating subject because we're constantly in the process of obviously discovering it or, like sloughing off old versions of it. But also, we're also sort of performing it in these public ways that seem increasingly have nothing to do with reality or how we actually are, especially when you're, in the process of performing the same work again and again and again until it feels like you can't even hear it when you're playing it in a funny way, which is obviously connects to mass production, which is, like the idea that selling 1 million records doesn't count as an achievement in terms of like you having made a thing and that many people wanted to experience it and liked it, presumably, at least some of them. The fact that they bought it, yeah, that's significant, but only as it reflects the fact that they wanted it and,
Right.
And have a relationship with it. But like the idea that that's not real enough because it wasn't 2 million or 5 million or whatever, that is a consumption-based ethic. Like that has nothing to do with what it is to listen
The
to
inherent
music.
value of the work.
Right. It would be very difficult, I think, to imagine a situation where you would say, I sold 1 million records. I only sold 1 million. What a failure,
Right.
But I'm sure there are plenty of people who feel that way. I don't know.
I mean, we were told that. I mean, that's why our platinum record ceremony was funereal
Right.
in its vibe, because we hadn't sold 3 or 5 million.
Right.
The feeling was Closing Time, for all of its presence on the radio, just didn't sell our album. So there was something wrong with the band,
Right.
or something like that. And I think that it was a shame the extent to which that sort of hijacked my perception of who we are and what we were doing.
Did you believe that there was something wrong with the band or something not enough about the band?
I always assumed it was me.
Does that reflect sort of a tendency that predates the band? Or
Sure,
like
of course, yeah.
Right.
It has. I don't think it's really reality based. Dan, I remember sitting in his living room once with him and his wife Diane, and I can't remember what had just happened, but Dan sort of laughed and turned to Diane and said, "One of the advantages of having Jake as a friend is if anything ever goes wrong, he always assumes it's his fault." So I think it's
That's
just
very Charlie Brown.
Yeah, maybe. I think it's just a sort of personal foible. It's not a great foible to have. But I think the important thing for me is that I eventually came to look at Semisonic as not a picture of something that had gone wrong or had not gone well.
Mm-hmm.
I now look at it and say, whoa, can't believe we got that experience. And sure, are there other things I wish we could have gotten or I could have gotten out of that? Of course. But would I like to roll the dice again and see if I could do better? Hell no.
Right.
Like we came out crazy ahead of the game.
It's a perspective that really is unavailable until a certain amount of time has passed.
Yeah, I think so.
And obviously there's personal growth involved, but there's also like, I remain surprised at the things from that era that have somehow managed to still be viable. I mean, obviously the world of like legacy airplay or whatever, like Closing Time, I still hear it all the time.
Yep.
Okay, hypothetical situation, you're out somewhere in a bar and Closing Time starts playing. What do you do? Do you listen and enjoy?
So here's an embarrassing answer. Before I recognize what it is, because usually there will be people talking.
Right. Too
I'll
quiet.
go, hey, what is this? This is kind of cool. And I go, oh, yeah. The only hard thing about hearing Closing Time out in the world is if I'm with somebody who knows me and then they're watching me listen to it. And then you have to be in this weird position of both being like their conversation partner and then also being watched for your reaction. And that's never comfortable. I don't really like that. But what I don't like about it is just how it removes me from just being able to like be there and hanging out.
But it is like time freezes when, I mean, for me, I first of all, if my song comes on, I know instantly because it starts with that 12 counts of rattling drums.
Right.
And I am out the door before the bass, the fuzzy bass kicks in. I cannot be in the room when it plays.
I've been out with people doing karaoke, and I've seen some of them like thinking that they're sneakily entering closing time in to be the last thing. And I just like, I'll find a reason to excuse myself so I don't have to be there and enact a response that is adequate for their sort of expectation.
Right, which is impossible to gauge.
Yeah.
Because it's very much like the thing what you just said about like watching you listen to it.
Yeah.
Like if you evince pride, then you're that person, you're prideful or you're full of yourself still. But if you're like, then you're weirdly ashamed and that doesn't live up to what people want. It's like, this isn't really a complaint. It's just an observation about like, you cannot know what people want.
The thing I most fear is letting them down.
Right.
They want me to be happy in that moment, and which is wonderful. That's what a friend would want for someone who had been, in a band like that. But I think that it's just hard to deliver visible happiness in a way that feels like it's both authentic and also adequate, like enough. So that's
another performance of the self.
That's all that really goes through my mind. Like I'm not sick of the song, actually. I have like a long list of things that I focus on with any song, because I'm just trying to give the most beautiful rendering of whatever it is we're up to. I think one metaphor I stumbled upon for it is when you're walking through airport security and you see yourself in profile as you're, because there's a camera aiming at your ears and you're with your eyes, you see it, and then you turn to look at it.
And you can never catch it.
But you can't catch it.
Right.
And that's kind of what it is to perform. Like
that's great. That's
perfectly stated. You can either just like play the song, play the music, and focus on that, or you can look out and say, "Holy crap! We're at RFK Stadium, or we're on Letterman, or whatever." But you can't do both. And so I know where I want to be in that moment, which is playing the music and just focusing on that. I can always come back and sort of watch it later and maybe take in a little bit of the taste of what it might have been like to just sort of sit there and contemplate what the meaning of the moment was. But I think that that's just too much for me. I'm sure that Taylor Swift, when she's out on stage, is thinking like, here's the chorus, like, here's my focus here. Like, I'm sure any performer who's done it a lot thinks that way. Like you just have to have your to-do list to get through it, to focus on it, to stay on mission, and to perform at your best.
Well, there are lots of ways to think about what sort of the performer audience dynamic ought to be. And I have gone through the thing of being like, I'm allowed to alienate the audience now. That will be my gesture. And then there's the one where like, I will serve the audience now. But basically what you're talking about of just like immersing yourself in the doing of the thing while you're doing it and being free from self-consciousness, essentially, is like, that's what you dream of happening with performance. And in a way, that's how it sort of has to be. But I also have had the experience many times of, especially on tour, the thing where you're, like I'll be singing a song and then I will become conscious of the fact that I am thinking about that I am singing the song. And then when those two minds kind of reconverge, that's when I lose my place. I think there's something in that sort of consciousness is sort of not the goal.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's like everybody has probably had the experience of sitting in a movie theater and recognizing, coming out of the movie for a second, or coming out of the experience of watching the film and realizing, oh, I'm in a theater watching a film.
Right.
And now you're no longer connected to what's actually happening on the screen. You're like watching the screen as an object instead of being like just swallowed up in it. I developed that sort of to-do list approach to save me from stage fright. and panic, which I still battle. I mean, I was battling it last month out on the road. I just have a to-do list for every song because it's a safe place to go to, as opposed to the sort of meta consciousness,
Pure being.
what does it mean that I'm here
Right.
kind of thought, which is terrible. That's just like awful to have.
It's funny in light of the fact that you wrote a book about the time in the band, that particular moment, which is, I mean, an excellent book that I have returned to lots of times. And I also think it's sort of a definitive book about that kind of moment where you are observing yourself doing a thing and then wondering if you're doing it right or wrong, or if you should be thinking about it differently. Like, that is the nature of, I think, like undergoing the kind of success that you're supposed to aspire to, I guess, if you're doing this. I mean, obviously, you lose your license to complain. That's thing one. It doesn't stop a lot of performers from complaining. But like, if you have any sense of propriety at all, you don't complain, because when people who are in successful bands complain, it sounds like bragging to almost anyone else.
I also think like some of the very best artists are really good at that. I mean, Prince is a great example.
Yeah.
Prince would watch his shows every night after the performance. He'd stay up till like 3 or 4 in the morning. I mean, the band members of the Revolution would tell us that their phones would ring at like 3 in the morning, and it would be Prince and saying, you missed a crash on the second chorus of 1999, and then hang up. And he was like really attentive to it. And he was sort of like, maybe that's just, I think that's probably how he was wired.
First of all, he was unique in the world, or at least as rare a breed as can be, calculated, because of course the attention to that kind of detail that comes along with it, but also being able to sort of, writing a song on the guitar, but then hearing the finished version in his head and then executing it, often by playing everything himself or enlisting the people who will exactly play what he needs. Like, that's a version of, I mean, I hesitate to say insanity, but like that's a different kind of mind than most of us get anywhere near having.
I think all of the things you just described are things that you or me or any number of people we know all care about.
Mm-hmm.
The difference with Prince is that he roped out, he would sleep 6 hours a night, right, and kill himself the rest of the day, pushing
following
to improve all of it.
Right.
So I think that, like I saw, there's a great video of Prince crashing a James Brown performance. Have you seen this?
I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah. He's not that amazing in that performance. It's just early in his career. And then only a few years later, he's doing like those videos for Raspberry Beret and all that stuff. And it's just like amazing.
Yeah.
And I think like the growth is entirely a result. It's not like he was just born perfect. He just worked like crazy. And that's why I like think like, well, Prince-like success is just not ever going to be something I would ever know.
Right.
Because I just don't have that kind of, I don't have the juice for it.
Well, what's really interesting is that for all his sort of imperial, like, he created and released some of the greatest music, like, in the history of the West, like he was non-pareil, like there wasn't another Prince, but he kept going and remained, I think, as fastidious about every little detail for a long time. And it didn't mean that it doesn't all result in amazing, like the best work. Right. But the work of his that was the best was so surpassingly great that you were like, there was always a chance, it seemed, And so, and then when he died, it really was like, it was, I think, an experience a lot of people shared of like going back and like, oh, yeah, what does that album Come sound like? And then you listen to it and it's actually surprisingly really good. Or, like any of the records. I mean, he made so much music.
Yeah.
And like that alone is sort of a thing where, yeah, like you were saying that when you think about, regret or whatever, when you wish you could have done something differently, it would have been to play drums more and practice more and write more songs. That's always, for me, the regret that, you can complain about all sorts of things, but if you're not really putting in the energy to be truly prolific and truly committed to the thing, in a way, everything that happens is just sort of dumb luck or luck-based,
Right.
And that's a sobering thing because when you're, when you luck out into being a professional musician in a band that people have even heard of or whatever, you have any kind of following, there is a tendency to be like, I do have this going for me. And most people don't. Almost nobody does.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's good or valid or anything. It's just what happened to you and what you did with it. And I, like as time goes by, making peace with it is sort of like, you must have made some peace with it at some point, because you would go totally insane if you were tortured by, I don't know, like the performance of All About Chemistry or whatever, or for us, King James Version, our second album, like the feeling of being just robbed because it didn't like, the whatever went right during the successful time still wasn't quite satisfying, but you were like, the next one, it's going to be all these great things, and then it'll also be even better in some way.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't happen, and it feels like the narrative that you have constructed has been somehow, you've been robbed. But you haven't been robbed. You just had all your luck at once.
And I think that what bands are often up to, or what musicians in bands are sometimes up to, is they're waiting for the world to tell them that it's a good thing that they're there making music. And the world can't tell you that. The music business sure can't tell you that, and it won't tell you that.
Right. Or if it does, it's often really wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But I think a lot of the chasing the tail experience of being a musician in a band is trying to get an answer to the question, am I good? Am I great?
Am I special?
Am I special? Amazing. Yeah. And no one can answer that question. It's an unanswerable question. And I sort of at a certain point, I realized that I can't answer the question, am I a great drummer? Am I a great writer? I can only answer the question, did I drum today? Did I write today?
It's hard, though, living in the world to just like free yourself from asking that unanswerable question. Because really the thing should be not to ask it, not to wonder, not to need to know if you are great, or not to credit the notion of greatness in that particular way as it corresponds to like your worth, you know, like it shouldn't be necessary for you to be thought of as great or called great in order to feel valid.
Right.
But that is a true symptom of living now. I mean, it's not like it wasn't true before, but it's really true now, partly just due to the inflationary language, so like where everything is genius or epic or whatever, like those kind of the terms of just being like good, dutiful, like honest,
right,
kind, thoughtful. Those are all essentially those are the values that still matter, but how do you magnify those things or perform those things in such a way that they're seen when you feel totally invisible?
Yeah.
In a world that really increasingly values only that which is most obviously visible.
Right.
And that does correspond to doing music in a way, because why do you need to be bigger in order to feel valid? Mm-hmm. You know, why do you need to succeed according to these terms that are the terms that you signed on to be part of? And like, why do you need it to be the case that there is something wrong with your band that because you didn't sell 1 million or because you didn't sell more than 1 million copies?
Yeah.
And that, I think, ultimately resides in the people, who are doing the band. Like some people seem to be able to slough that stuff off, or at least to seem to be able to. You know, I think it does haunt people who do things publicly. But those kind of questions, they're like the stuff of, like, takes lifetimes to figure it out.
Yeah.
You know?
I think it's important for all of us to remember that some of the most special experiences that any of us have had may involve, for instance, in music, bands that almost no one else has heard of.
Yes.
You know, I remember seeing so many bands who maybe were briefly on major labels, but even other bands who never got on major labels, whose performances changed my life. You know, I grew up in Champaign, Illinois. There was a band called The Rave. They never got signed to a major label. They were amazing. And I my whole consciousness was filled with their music as a kid. And they definitely just have shaped their music. And I'm sure no one outside of those who grew up in Champaign, Illinois, when I was around back then, had ever heard of them.
Right.
And yet I know that they are a huge part of how their music has shaped a big part of how I listen to music. And I remember hearing like a poet read at a poetry reading in Oakland, California in like 1986 or 7 or something. And I remember the poem, like a lot of the poem to this day. And yet I can't remember the poet's name. I'm sure this guy never, I'm sure most libraries don't have his books. But I just do think it's important for us to remember that a lot of the best creation is done by people whose names you don't know and you'll never know, and whose work maybe only you and a few other people will know, but they make a really big dent on how you understand things.
I have identical experiences with bands that never really made it out of Seattle, who we used to play with, when there would be 7 people there or whatever. And you know, maybe they got it together to make a record or something, but even if they had a tape, and I would, partly because I was just blindly feeling my way through, how do you write? What is this? Like, what is a song? What do you do? Like, and they seemed to have some thing. They just had something, and it was born out of the same enthusiasm that I had and my friends had, but they just had it together a little bit more or a little bit sooner, and there was something completely transformative to me about the stuff they did. And they might not even remember having made that thing if you talk to them today. But and in fact, interestingly, like, I had a very similar experience with a poem being not read so much as declaimed to me when the first time we went to Austin for South by Southwest. One of our old friends who he actually was the original sort of drummer in Harvey Danger. He wasn't really a drummer. Harvey Danger wasn't really a band at that time. But he moved to Austin and was like immersed in the community of poets there. And Evan, our eventual drummer, whom you would have met back then, like, he and I went to this guy's house, and we were, I think, crashing on their floor during South by Southwest. And it was this guy, Ken, and his then boyfriend, Richard. They were both poets. And we all kind of got a little drunk and a little high. And then Ken was like, I wrote a new one. Do you want to hear it? And we were like, oh, yes, please. It was just one of those kind of nights. And he did this. I will never forget it. And I remember much of the poem now. And in fact, he, several years later, died in Chicago. It turned out he was epileptic. He didn't even realize that. And he had a seizure, and he fell on the cement under a bridge, under the L, and it was winter, and he cracked his head and on the icy sidewalk, and died in the most anonymous way you can die, in many respects. But that poem, I have since read it I read it on the radio after he died. But I have spent a lot of time with it. Probably 30 people in the world will have ever heard this poem. But to me, it's right up there with, Randall Jarrell or, Anne Sexton or any of the poets who have really affected me in their way. It's to me, a major work because it was made by this and the fact that I happen to know him was significant in this case, but it needn't have been because he was not making it for, he was just making it.
Right.
And that it's the easiest thing to forget, I think, when you enter the professional world is that there's a lot of really important value in the doing of things with zero expectation of who will receive it, certainly who will buy it, or anything like that. Just the thing of doing it.
Yeah. Another way of saying that same thing is a lot of things that people have never heard of are immensely valuable and are, for the people who do know them, often among the most valuable things they've ever encountered.
It's true. And that is one of the big things that people who work in the music business, any entertainment industry, it's one of the first things to go, I think. This idea that this record came out, it didn't do anything, therefore it doesn't exist and doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon I call rounding down to zero. And I think people get rounded down to zero quite a bit. And I mean, artists, it happens to artists, it happens to athletes. Mm-hmm. You see people they win the silver medal at the Olympics and it's this great tragedy and it must feel awful. And it's just this crazy kind of mentality that it's an all or nothing kind of way of viewing life that it has nothing to do with what life actually is.
Yeah, it's merciless.
Yeah.
This does lead to one of the kind of founding ideas of this podcast, which is, technically speaking, Semisonic is not a one-hit wonder because I know that
we're a 2.5 hit wonder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the singles that did well in Europe don't count the same way in America. Harvey Danger is maybe a definitive example of the one-hit wonder phenomenon in culture, and whatever reaction you can have to that notion, I have had. And I don't know that I have a final one, but I'm really curious what your perspective is on not the term, although that too, the weird hostility that accompanies it, and the sort of gloating thing where people say, "Oh, they're a one-hit wonder," and why that seems like a source of such amusement or such sort of it's almost a bully. It's a term that a bully would use.
I think that what you're describing is people see that you were ambitious because you had a hit and then you reached your limit with one hit.
Right.
And so that the one hit is sort of like a snow globe of your ambition, and they get to hold it in their hand and kind of look around and be amused by it.
Rosebud.
Yeah, exactly. Rosebud. But I think that though I was briefly kind of a little bit well, screw you,
Yeah.
If people want to call Semisonic a one-hit wonder, which they do, the experience of the band is so much more than that for me.
Right.
But I can't really control. I really just can't control how other people think about it, and the effort of going around and revising everybody's understanding of who we are is just not worth it. And it's actually, it's impossible, and I have so many better things to do. So I kind of just by necessity have let go of that. Part of me also thinks man, so many of the bands I love never had a hit.
To say nothing of the long list of bands that had one hit, and those hits are great songs that are among my favorite, because I've done that too.
Yeah.
yes, you could say it's any number of shitty single hits, but then also like, is I Melt With You less than a perfect song? Like less than something that anyone should be proud to have completed? And like, I say that from my lofty perch. I'm sure I've listened to that whole Modern English record, but I can't remember anything else about it, really.
I would say I mainly just feel super lucky about Closing Time.
Right.
I can't remember the last time I played the Closing Time card in a conversation. I think it's probably been years, but someone else will often play that card. They'll say, "Yo, no, you know Jake's band, you know the song Closing Time," and it automatically gives me credibility as an artist, and for having like had some success, which, as we just discussed, is kind of weird and maybe wrong. But in terms of my relationship to being called a one-hit wonder, I'll definitely take that one hit.
Right.
And at least be able to say, well, yeah, that's one way of looking at that's one measure of success I suppose you could have about us. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't think of it that way, but I'm perfectly fine with it.
Like, it has long been perfectly valid for bands that haven't ever been, like, that people have never heard of, but that are great. Like, the fact that they didn't have commercial success is never a bar to entry, never a reflection of any sort of, anything that somehow diminishes them.
Yeah.
If anything, it magnifies them in certain respects. But I think that, like, it's not so much that it matters, because it doesn't actually matter. It's just, in certain circumstances, it just sucks to, like, be on the receiving end of that epithet, like it does to be on the receiving end of any epithet that isn't, any epithet really, but like when somebody tries to hurt you by diminishing you, by giving you a name. But like, it has to correspond to this exact thing you were saying before, that like, you can't answer the question if you're great. But if that's true, you can't also answer the question that whether you suck, like, or like, you have to not care. You have to, or at least work towards not caring.
Yeah, I guess the first people to call us a one-hit wonder were MTV. They made there was some half-hour show in which they said, here are the one-hit wonders of our day, and Semisonic was one of them. And I definitely felt like a kind of snarky intent behind that. But I also kind of realized, those people are not people whose opinions I'm really worried about. In fact, most of the people I was sort of hoping to impress had not even heard of Semisonic.
Right.
And so mentally I had other places to go with all of that energy. So I really, like, when Closing Time was out, and the radio would not stop playing it. Even to the extent that we wanted them to play our next single.
Right.
And they just would say, no, we're going to keep playing Closing Time.
Precisely my experience.
And I remember people kind of hating the song and hating us just for its ubiquitous presence on the radio. And I remember feeling kind of, I don't like being like resented. But again, if it's a choice between that problem and the problem of like, we never got heard.
Right. Or any of a million like real problem, not that it's not real to you in the moment, but like there is that element of like,
absolutely.
Are you really complaining about too many people buying your record?
Fired from their jobs, or like, they can't make their house payments, or like, they're dying, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a pretty trivial kind of thing to be concerned about. And
it is, it's a little bit cheating to bring it to that level, because of course we're talking specifically about this experience, but that is I think a really important component of weathering that weird experience. There's not a huge number of people who have it, and there's an even smaller number than that of people who are like able to talk about it with any kind of, or willing to talk about it at least, with any sort of reflection. There's just the sort of, we got fucked over, or yeah, things are great. That's been my experience of finding it. But like, it does connect to something I think I mentioned weeks ago when this interview began. So, that's not an apology. I love it. But like, I said at the beginning that, you know, the time we encountered you at the beach house was really instructive to me, and sort of a kind of, here you are, like, here's everything you need to know in one experience. The better version of that was when we toured opening for you guys for like 3 weeks in August of 1998, and it is now August of 2023. We went to London for a week to do press. We went to Paris for a week to do press. Then we played one show in each town. And then we flew back from Paris, France to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which was like such a great crash course in, you know, cultural whatever. And it was hilarious. But we started touring with you guys. And I do remember that despite the fact that this process of having a hit song and working to make it bigger or whatever, riding that wave, have been going on now for 3-4 months, and the excitement had definitely sort of dulled into tedium, because every day was exactly the same. And the people we were playing to were not people we necessarily recognized as, I mean, they were younger than we were. Culturally, they were just sort of, obviously, they were being inspired by what they heard on the commercial radio, which was none of our experience, really. So there was definitely a little bit of like cognitive dissonance, where we believed that we were in one kind of band that just happened to be having this totally different experience. And that was how I think we reconciled the thing of like, this is not my beautiful house, this is not my beautiful wife, you know, because we really did fancy ourselves a different kind of thing. But it didn't matter at that point, because when that song got played on the radio, that's what we became.
Mm-hmm.
And we had no mechanism to surrender to it at all.
Right.
And so the snob voice in me, which was loud, was like, Semisonic, I can't believe we're touring with them. They're just another band in our situation. Like, why aren't we touring with name cool band here?
Yeah.
And then we got to the show and we met you guys, and everybody was really nice. And it was like, you know, of course, sold out crowd. The idea of being like turning up your nose at a sold out audience anyway is sort of disgusting to me now. But like, sure enough, I turned my nose right up at it. But I saw you guys sound check, and I was like, oh, sounds, you know, okay. And then we played our show, and I have no idea if it was good or bad. I have no idea if anything we did was good or bad. But it felt fine.
It was great.
And then I watched your whole set, and I was like, any sense that, first of all, we were somehow not in the same sort of musical aesthetic league was gone. Instantly it was clear to me that you guys were playing music that I absolutely not only understood and like embraced, but I really, really loved it.
Mm-hmm.
But you were all so good at your instruments, and there was nothing like stumbly or ramshackle about it, which was so much a part of our thing that we sort of, you know, it was like the weakness that we pretended was an intention, you know?
Sometimes the ramshackle is amazing, though.
I agree.
It's not to be dismissed.
I agree. It's just skill is not to be dismissed because it isn't stumbling. You know
Sure.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
And that was, I think, where we were coming from in some weird, not fully articulated or articulatable, and certainly not defensible way.
Mm-hmm.
But I watched your set and I was just like, God damn it. It's like, this is, in the very best sense of the word, totally pro,
Mm-hmm.
but also really good.
Mm-hmm.
And also everyone in the audience sang every word to every song, not just the ones on the new record, the ones on the first record. Like, it was a devout audience. And I then spent the next 3 weeks watching your entire set every single night and feeling like I was being given a masterclass in doing what you are there to do as well as you can do, and loving it while it's happening, and meaning it, and being good at your job. Even thinking of it as a job at that point was something I simply refused to do, because I refused to acknowledge that I was in the music business. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to happen to be there, even though all I cared about in the world was that band and the songs we wrote, and everything of myself was absolutely in it. But to admit that fully would have to involve embracing the things about myself and my work that were not as good as I wanted them to be.
Right.
So it was so much about just embracing the, like, hey, we turned up, like, maybe we'll play some songs or whatever, but that weird disingenuous thing that I thought of as disingenuous, which was also part of the act, as it were. Like, it was part of what our show was. I'm not saying it had no merit. I'm saying it didn't have legs. You know, it wasn't something that you build anything out of. It was obvious. Like, all I can see when I look back at it now is fear, you know, just fear of being found out.
Right.
And we spent time hanging out on your bus, and we had conversations that I remember being really genial and really good. Not like we all became best friends or anything, but like everything we talked about was interesting. You guys were leagues more interesting than most bands that we experienced on the road, because you had interests, you know, that weren't just rock and roll in the business, but like you also were good at talking about rock and roll, and you just like, it was a pleasure on a level that I had not experienced and really needed. And also the absolute quality of what you were doing resonated in me in a way that I still feel, because I was so wrong to dismiss even the possibility that it would be good based on nothing. I mean, really, like a contempt that was about contempt for myself in so many ways, but the being thrust into this context that didn't feel right. To find that, yeah, there's art here too, and art that matters to me has been like truly a liberating thing, because it has broadened my consciousness.
It means so much to hear that. I mean, I remember those shows. The first show I remember was in Virginia, I think. Mm-hmm. I remember thinking you guys were so clear about who you were. It's very interesting to hear you say almost the opposite. And I think that we, in turn, well, especially whenever any of the music biz voices were in the room, we're often wondering who we were. One of the big challenges for Semisonic was always, and just for me personally, I think in life, has been trying to figure out a sort of Instagrammable image of what it is I do, or in the case of Semisonic, what it is we do, that is like just singular, and we are this. We just are never able to do that, and it's such a disadvantage. I don't think it's because we are rich or complex or anything. I just think that's hard to do that, and we have never figured out really how to do that. To this day, when people say, "What kind of music is Semisonic?" I mean, that's just, I can never come up with a good. You know, I'll say something like, it's a melodic song band with guitars and drums and bass, and
which is accurate, but also like
nothing like it just.
Oh, so it's song-based songs?
Yeah.
I know. I have the same thing.
It's this struggle to become Instagrammable, to use that metaphor, is really hard. I think it's hard for me. And knowing you, I think maybe for similar reasons, that I'm very self-conscious.
Yeah.
I never like pictures of me. I don't like hearing my voice, my singing voice or my talking voice. And so I basically never like the singular image
Yeah.
of anything that we do. And that's a hard thing, but it's a far more universal problem than people may know. I mean, all the stories about John Lennon doing anything to change his voice in the studio because he didn't like the way he sounded, which, you know, blows my mind. But I think that there's got to be a zillion other cases of like artists we just love and adore who disliked what they were doing and didn't understand it, and it didn't do what they wanted it to do. And that's part of the weird thing about art, is that part of what we love. I mean, how many records do we love by artists who hate that record? Or,
I mean, it's often the case that the band's best known song, they can't stand it.
Right.
And they never want to hear it again.
Right.
That's a much, I mean, I think, I'm not saying that you hate Closing Time or that I hate Flagpole Sitta, though it's like I would never suggest that it was my favorite of what we've done.
Yeah, Closing Time's not my favorite. I don't hate it, but it's not my favorite.
But it's true, you're not necessarily you're not the best judge.
Well, it's an impossible job. It's an impossible job, and you really have to separate yourself from it. And that's one thing I wish I had known to do. I wish I had figured that out earlier on, just like, hey, you're not in charge of that. Just make things, drum and make things, and let's just go that path.
Right. Take a nap, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is amazing how the experience of the thing that can't be replicated, which is that sort of somewhat accidental, but whatever, fortuitous success, where a lot of things have to happen at the same time in exactly the right way, and therefore it just can't happen again, or is unlikely to happen again. It's amazing how that sticks with you, regardless of how you feel about it. You know, it's just that it was a time that, I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask you, because I think about it myself a lot, is that, you know, it is 25 years later. Obviously, you have done other things in that intervening time. You've also done some other Semisonic things, but you've done things that have nothing to do with it. Do you ever reflect on the fact that you're still talking about that band and that time?
I don't know. I mean, I know that I'm still with that in my life. I will always be talking about it. I never really think about like what that means.
Right.
I'm just doing it. You know, I take drum lessons. You know, I'm just like, hey, I got a drum. You know, I wrote like a song and a half for our new record. I'm not great at the sort of big picture, taking it all in kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I get a little too, I'm just not very good at it. And I tend not to go there. If I do, I get kind of depressed. Because I just, why do I get depressed? It's not that I feel like we failed or anything. It's just that it's not a satisfying mental exercise.
There's reason to wonder if it's worth doing anyway, but there is also the thing where the bigger the picture, the smaller the figure you cut within it, which is like in some ways I think in a kind of lifetime way, it's a super valuable thing to realize. That has been very valuable for me. But when you are trying to take stock of the worth of what you've done, and even just the like, how good of a story is it? How resonant was it? This thing that remains like, I wouldn't argue that the fact that I sang in a band that had a hit song a long time ago is the most interesting thing about me. I mean, I don't know what I would nominate for, you know, like to beat it out, but like, I do know that having had the experience of fame and success in show business, even in the narrow way that I did, is the thing that the greatest number of people I have ever met or will ever meet will be interested in hearing about.
Sure.
Which is, I mean, it's not like this is not a podcast about that exact thing. So like, I'm not being coy about it, but like, I was unwilling to. I was somewhere near obsessed with doing anything else. I have done so many other things since then, and I didn't ever fail to or refuse to enjoy the doing of them. That is where I always lose my self-consciousness, like we were saying before, like the making of things, writing songs, doing performances, with making films, writing things. I am blissfully not thinking about who I am or where I fit in the world. But when they come out and are, like received in some way by a few people or whatever, it never has the experience of being known by so many people that I couldn't even possibly know all of them. It has become less important to me that things I do achieve that.
Right.
But when I was younger, it felt like the experience of fame and notoriety was the only solution to the kind of anonymity I felt and the kind of rejection I felt by my family and like all that sort of stuff that is somewhat adolescent but also somewhat eternal,
One difference between our careers is that you were the front man.
Right.
You're the songwriter. And you were in the center of the spotlight. And whereas I was sort of like 3 feet from the spotlight,
mm-hmm.
and I had this sort of like side view of things. And I was always waiting for the moment where we became so famous that even the drummer would be known.
Right.
But we never got there.
Yeah.
And so I never felt like I was famous. I felt like our song was famous. I never even really felt like our band was famous. I'm always surprised when people know the name of my band.
Right.
And actually, I kind of enjoy the sort of lack of scrutiny that comes with that level of like, I'm connected to something. So it's a kind of a sweet spot in a way. Like I described it recently as like the ratio of like fun to anxiety is pretty favorable for someone like me. I had the sense of like my stock rising amongst people who knew me.
Right.
Well,
yeah, fame is weirdly relative as well. Like you were certainly famous at Semisonic shows.
Right.
For the most part. And then, you sort of broaden out from there. But it was the same for me with Harvey Danger, except people often thought I was Harvey Danger. And also, when you said that you always blamed yourself if people didn't like the band, I absolutely blame myself because it's true.
You're
if
right.
people didn't like the band, it was because they didn't like me. And who can blame anyone for not liking you?
Right.
I've never had that problem. I always am like astonished if they do like me. But seriously, that was very difficult. But because I always felt that there must be just a terrible stigma, and I was terrified to be anywhere.
Right.
And I really did have I had a couple of years of genuine agoraphobia and like dread of all interactions.
Mm-hmm.
Because I never knew if it was going to be friendly or not. And I prayed for indifference to the extent that I prayed, which was not very much. But like, that was the best case scenario. So, I really do understand. Like, when someone hadn't heard of it or pretended not to have heard of it, that was great.
Mm-hmm.
That was really like a huge relief. Except then I would be like, well, I got recognized so much in public for a relatively short period of time, but like a couple, maybe like 3 or 4 years. Certainly the closer I got to Seattle, the more recognizable I became. But like, then when no one is recognizing you ever, then you're like, wait, I shave my legs for this?
Right. Right. I think one thing I can say that's different because of Semisonic is I let go of wondering whether or not I'm a lousy bum.
Right.
I think the success of Closing Time, I don't even take credit for Closing Time. I didn't write it. I didn't sing it. I played drums on it. But for whatever reason, it just sort of like helps me stop worrying about that. And that's really the biggest difference for me is nobody recognizes me on the street. Nobody, actually once a year somebody does.
Right.
That's like my level of like I don't know, on the A list, B list, I'm somewhere down in like the R's or S's.
Mm-hmm. Respectable.
Yeah.
Satisfactory. RNS,
somewhere,
yeah.
But that's a pretty amazing difference. I don't think you have to become famous to have that difference.
Right.
And I think that's one thing, like in the classroom as a teacher, I think I'm trying to give people an experience of just their validity, which is different than a participation trophy.
Right.
Validity is something that is just inherent in human beings, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it took the song, the success of Closing Time and all the sort of heat around that for me to sort of just allow that into me.
Mm-hmm. So that you believed it.
So that I believed it. And that's the main difference in my life from then forward.
Yeah.
But I don't think I needed to wait until, when did that happen? 98. So I was 37.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I needed to spend all those years before then wondering.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't necessarily, it shouldn't have required a big hit song for that shift to come about. And I think that if I learned one thing from it, it's like, do my part in helping other people, regardless of who they are or what they're doing, like just sort of get in touch with that validity about who they are early on, because it's greatly freeing.
Yeah.
Actually, I do feel there's a sort of freedom that comes with that feeling of validity. You're no longer having to prove
I didn't do nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's so that's one thing I really try to accomplish in the classroom, is to help students feel seen and affirmed for who they are.
I mean, that is one of the sort of cardinal gifts that teachers can bestow. And great teachers do it in a variety of ways, but like really by like concentrating on the stuff you do at all. That's increasingly not nothing. Like it's harder and harder to send up a flare in the world and have anybody acknowledge it. And I think that's not obviously all that instruction consists of, but like it's so interesting. Like the English teacher, I had 2 teachers in high school without whom I never would have fucking done anything.
Right.
Probably. Who stoked my interest in writing and my appreciation for it, and who were incredibly exacting and like really rigorous, but also very generous, and really like encouraged the things in me that I desperately needed someone to encourage and see. And also were like, maybe those things are not so great that you should not necessarily concentrate, like, without saying, don't do that, that's stupid, do this, it's maybe good. Like, they were really great teachers to me, and I think they were dedicated, lifelong teachers. One of them just died last week, and
wow.
I've just been reflecting on the steadiness of his, like, the way he noticed the way I developed and encouraged it and really helped it along. This is like far more than any single person ever in my life has done. And I haven't seen him in at least 20 years and hadn't thought about him for 30 or whatever. I haven't thought about him for a long time, but he was necessary. And when you talk about teaching, I wonder what the dynamic is, or what has sort of changed in the classroom environment from when you were a student, particularly in terms of what students need, or want, because I have to assume it's radically different from when you were in school, even if basically being seen and acknowledged is at the heart of a lot of it.
I don't really, I hear a lot of people say, like, a lot of people express that. I haven't noticed that myself. I think one thing I'm just focused on, however, is like I recognize in so many of the students the insecurity with which I was struggling, and the question of self-worth, questions about self-worth that I was struggling with. And I think my goal always is just to be the teacher I wished I had had. I had a few of them, and they were game changers for me, but I didn't have enough of them. And I recognize in the students all the stuff I was struggling with, actually, just absolutely all of it.
Yeah.
And, you hear things about like students of today don't want to work. That's definitely not the case with my students. Like I work them hard and they love being worked hard. They kind of complain a little bit, but they do love to work hard.
To it.
They love discovering their ability to do it.
It was a huge part of what these teachers did for me. The rigor and the expectation of doing more than you think you're able to do.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a great expression of belief.
Yeah.
Demanding the work.
Yeah.
Like saying, you can do this. Let's do it together. I'll help you do it, but we've got to do it. And that's like not negotiable.
Right.
Doing the work is not negotiable. And that's the same in art. Like when you're an artist, like I have a number of students who like, they find out I'm a musician, they're musicians. And like, it's the thing I talk about is like, you gotta do a lot of it.
Yeah.
And that message does get through.
I mean, it does sort of tie into what you said a minute ago about, closing time happened when you were 37 and it alleviated this sense of like you feeling like a bum or nothing, but that you shouldn't have needed it to have happened in order to feel that way. But it does seem clear that insight, that it shouldn't have needed to take that long, or it shouldn't have needed to be based in an achievement.
Right.
That's the reward. I mean, that's the insight.
Yes.
In a way that I think is supremely valuable.
Yeah.
But you can't know that it shouldn't have had to be the thing that happened unless the thing happened. And so
No, it's always like that. It's the end of the Wizard of Oz or any story.
That's
you
right.
sort
You
of
could have
realize
gone
you
home
were
anytime
looking
you
for
wanted.
in the wrong place for the wrong thing.
That's right. It was always closing time.
Yeah.
So it's probably a good idea to wrap this up, though I am really enjoying it.
Yeah.
I must say.
Me too.
Every interview that I have read of yours and listened to and stuff in preparation for this and over the years, there's been an allusion to a second book that you are working on.
Yeah.
Are you still working on it?
I am still working on it. And I decided to write this book because it's about an aspect of my life that I have a hard time talking about, which is exactly why it's been a hard book to write.
Sure.
Because I'm trying to talk about something on the page that I can't really talk about out loud very easily or comfortably. So it's just been a hell of a book to get out of me. I fight off a lot of shame about how long this book has taken, but it's going to happen at some point. It's just that, you know how it is with songs. The song you spend like a year writing is never as good as the one that takes 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to resign myself to knowing that as important as writing this book is to me, the end result may not have any direct relationship.
Right.
How I feel about the end result may not have any direct relationship to how much work I've put into it.
Yeah. But also, I mean, you don't wake up with a book, like the way Paul McCartney woke up with Yesterday, supposedly. But I'm wondering if all the other stuff, everything you just said aside, because I mean, I understand the notion of like grappling with things that, I mean, obviously if it was easy to talk about, you wouldn't need to write a book or whatever. Like that idea is I understand it. But the cultural interest in fame or collisions with success or whatever, it like pre-allows you to write a book about your time in the music business or whatever,
Right.
that there's your permission has been granted to talk about this stuff all the time, but the stuff that the book that you have been working on, presumably since this one, or roughly around that time, which is coming up on like 20 years,
Yes.
is the fact that it isn't about music or this experience specifically, that it's about another element of yourself.
It might be a factor. I think that, my first book, I wrote it really quickly, actually. I mean, I wrote it in a year and a half, which seems insane as I think about it now. I mean, it just seems like, how did that happen? It was a more condensed time period, and it was a more condensed, the boundaries around the subject matter were more clearly defined.
Right.
So I had an easier time, for instance, knowing what's in, what's out.
Right.
Where do I start? Where do I finish? What goes in there? And the spectacle of the material was just so easy.
Right.
It was like walking through an amusement park and just,
Right.
here's the roller coaster and here's the bumper cars.
Oh, you were on TV? Tell me about that. What was that like?
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
everybody wants to know that.
all the people, and so I felt like my assignment was really clear. My book agent said, I want to learn 50 things about the music business I didn't already know. And I thought, okay, great.
Right.
I'll tell you. But in the case of this book, the agenda, I think, has always been more amorphous. And I think I've finally figured out what the agenda is. But of course, you think that until you're done doing it, and then you realize you even had a different agenda.
Yeah.
So, or purpose.
I mean, in the best of circumstances, I think that's true.
Yeah,
As
absolutely.
well as the most frustrating ones.
Yeah.
Jacob, thank you so much for coming and talking. This was great. It could not have been better.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.